Hey guys, it's Chris at Highline Guitars. You're watching another one of my YouTube guitar building videos. If you're new to the channel, welcome. I hope that by the end of this video, I'll have earned the honor and privilege of your subscription. And of course, to everybody who's watching, if you find yourself enjoying this video or getting anything out of it, I would really appreciate it if you would take a second to click that thumbs up button. That really helps the channel. What I'm going to be talking about in today's video is I'm going to be applying the finish on my 6-string multi-scale fan fret guitar. In the video I posted last week, I tried to stress the importance of testing the finish that you plan to apply on scrap wood before committing to the actual guitar itself. And the reason for this should be fairly obvious. Number one, you want to see what the finish is going to look like. Oftentimes, you really have no idea how your different finishing products are going to look on the wood until you actually do some tests. And the one thing you don't want to do is start applying it without testing, only to realize that the look that you're achieving is not exactly what you were hoping for. So testing can help determine how it's going to look. It can also help us to understand potential incompatibilities between the different products that we're using to finish. Because typically you're going to be using some kind of a colorant, a sealer, wood grain fillers, and a protective top coat. And there can be occasions when those products that you've selected to do this won't be compatible. They can react with one another and the results can be a disaster. So you want to make sure that there are no compatibility issues, and you can do that by testing. And another thing that can happen with testing is we kind of get a feel for how the products work as we apply them. And this is especially true if you're wiping on finishes. Testing is going to help you to get a feel for how best to apply those finishes. Now, in my case, when I did the testing, what I was doing was, it's gotten kind of dusty, but I applied the finish on this piece of scrap wood, which was cut from the same boards that I made the body with. And what I did was I used a homemade aniline dye. It's dye pigment mixed in with denatured alcohol. And then I filled the grain using my own mixture of a homemade grain filler. And this was a combination of polymerized tung oil mixed with sanding dust generated from the wood itself. And then I topped it, once all that had dried, with the polymerized Sutherland Wells polymerized tung oil high luster finish. This whole strategy worked quite well, and the testing indicated that it was going to look really nice, and I was pretty happy with it. But after some thought and some consideration, I have decided to make a fairly significant change in my finishing strategy. And what I decided to do instead is, rather than use the Sutherland Wells polymerized tung oil, I'm going to be using Z-Epoxy finishing resin. And this is a 2-part epoxy. I like this stuff because when you mix it up, it has a very thin viscosity, so it's easy to apply. You can wipe it on just like an oil finish, like the Sutherland Wells tung oil. However, it'll soak into the wood, and because it's a 2-part epoxy, it's going to dry through catalytic action, and the result is going to be a harder surface. And I decided to do this because this wood that I'm using, this is a wood that is known as Philippine mahogany. And as I've explained in previous videos, Philippine mahogany is really a term that is used to describe a variety of different mahogany-like woods that are grown in Southeast Asia, particularly in the Philippines. And there are, like I said, a lot of different species of wood, and this particular species, it's also known as light red Meranti, and it's a very lightweight wood, but it's very soft. It's almost as soft as pine or alder. So because of that, I'm concerned that if all I use as my top coat is the polymerized tung oil, the surface is going to be prone to dings and scratches and dents and that sort of thing. But by using the Z-Epoxy finishing resin, I can actually make the surface harder than it naturally is. So that should resist some of those dings and scratches. Now there are a variety of different ways that you can harden the surface of wood. I've done several different techniques in the past. One is to flood the surface with thin CA glue, let it soak in and cure, and that can make the surface really much more durable. It's really useful when you're doing or working with spalted maple, because spalted maple can have sections that are, we call it punky, and that means it's really soft. It's softer than balsa wood, so it's prone to significant damage. So using CA glue can really harden that surface. The problem with CA glue, however, is the fumes. The fumes can be really problematic to work with. So I prefer to stay away from using the CA glue, even though it does work really well. Another product that you can use to harden the surface is Solarez polyester resin. What you can do is you can heat it up either in a microwave or in a double boiler. And when you heat up the resin, it thins out to almost a water-like consistency. And then you can brush it on the surface while it's still warm and it will soak into the wood. Then when you expose it to sunlight, it cures rock hard in just a matter of minutes. And when I say it cures hard, it cures harder than any liquid resin top coating substance that I'm aware of. In fact, I think it's one of the hardest substances that you can use. But again, that's a product that it's a bit tricky to use because of the fumes and getting the viscosity right. So, but it does work really, really well. However, for this, I'm going to use the Z-Epoxy finishing resin, because when you mix these two, the resin has a kind of a warm amber hue that looks really nice on the wood. So I'm going to mix that up after I've applied the my homemade aniline dye, and that's really all it should take to do it. Now I have tested it. It was on that same piece of wood that I showed you earlier. I just did it on the other side, and it worked out really, really well. Best of all, it made the surface much harder than it is in its natural state, so it should be strong enough to resist, or hard enough to resist dents and scratches and dings and that sort of thing. So let me bring you in a little closer and we're going to get started here. The first thing I'm going to be doing is applying the dye mixture that I made, and this is a mixture of denatured alcohol and keta-aniline dyes. And I'm going to put links to the all the different products that I'm going to be using to finish this guitar down in the description below. But to mix this, I poured about 5 ounces of denatured alcohol into this plastic container that I purchased from Harbor Freight. Then I added a teaspoon each of brown and red keta-aniline dye to the solution, mixed it up, and then I let it sit for a couple of hours so that the pigment would more thoroughly and readily absorb into that denatured alcohol. Now you can also use water, but as I explained in my previous video, using water will raise the grain and create a rough surface, whereas the denatured alcohol won't raise the grain. It'll leave the surface nice and smooth after the dye has dried. So to apply it, I'm going to be using these Scott Paint and Stain cloths. These are really nice. They're fairly inexpensive, but they're a lint-free cloth. Now there's really no such thing as a totally lint-free cloth, but these come pretty close. And where you have to really be concerned about lint is around the cut edges. That's usually where most of your lint comes from. So what I like to do is fold these up so that the edge will be inside of the cloth as I apply the stain. so there's no cut edges that are present. And then I'm just going to apply this dye stain over the entire surface, but I'll get it pretty well saturated into this cloth. Now the effect here is fairly subtle, although it really depends on the angle that you're looking at the wood. It seems to change in its intensity as you change the angle of the wood. And as you can see, I'm wearing blue nitrile gloves, which is very important when you're working with an aniline dye, because aniline dyes are very, very strong and they will stain your fingers. And when they stain your fingers, you can count on that stain lasting for several days. Now, one thing you'll notice is that the color looks pretty strong and significant while the dye is wet, but as soon as it dries, it turns sort of a dull, lifeless, flat color. And that can be somewhat misleading, because then once I apply Z-epoxy finishing resin, it will restore to its brilliant color. I'm going to let the dye dry for about 30 minutes. And that's one of the nice things about using denatured alcohol as a base as opposed to water. Denatured alcohol will evaporate rapidly and the dye will dry very quickly. So in about 30 minutes, I can come back and start with the next step in the process. It's been 30 minutes and the aniline dye is dry. So I'm ready to move on to the next step. Now, in my test video that I posted last week, before I started applying the polymerized tung oil, I wanted to lock the dye into the wood. I was afraid that it might reactivate. So what I did was I sprayed the surface with Minwax Helmsman Spar Varnish. And I decided after doing some testing that that really wasn't necessary. For one thing, oddly enough, the Spar Varnish actually raised the grain. And I didn't like that result. It made the surface really rough. Right now, the surface is very, very smooth. I'm going to go ahead and start applying the Z-epoxy, and we'll see how that goes. All right, so Z-epoxy is basically just like any other two-part epoxy. You have a resin and then a hardener. So what I'm going to do is mix up equal parts, and there's a lot of advantages to using Z-epoxy, and one of them is you don't have to be hyper critical about measuring exact amounts. All you need to do really is eyeball it. Another advantage is a little goes a long way. So I'm going to mix up some of this resin, and I'm just going to mix it into, this is just one of those little plastic cups that you get at the drugstore. So I'll mix up roughly equal parts of it. And then I'll stir it up with a popsicle stick. And then when I spread this on the wood, initially I just like to use my fingers. And of course I'm wearing my blue nitrile gloves because you don't want to actually get this stuff on your fingers. It is glue basically. But I also like to keep some toothpicks handy because when I apply it to the wood, there's holes that I have drilled for mounting the bridge and other components. So I can use the toothpick to clean out those holes if they get clogged with the glue. So I'll keep those handy. Another nice advantage of Z-Epoxy is it has a long working time. And it's roughly 30 to 45 minutes before it really starts to tack up. So you have plenty of time to apply it and you don't really have to rush it. That's a nice feature. A lot of finishes that we use dry and tack up so quickly that they tend to start to dry before we have a chance to really get them spread evenly across the surface. So now what I'll do is I'll just pour a little bit out onto the surface. And I'm starting here with the top. I'm going to let the Z-Epoxy soak into the wood and dry, and that'll take probably 2 to 3 hours. Once it's dry, I can then come back and apply a second coat. And I may end up applying at least 3, maybe even 4 coats, maybe even 5. It's hard to say. I'll apply a coat, let it dry, and then I'll come back and assess the surface quality and see if I feel like it's necessary to apply additional coats. And I think a lot of it has to do with the surface quality and the sheen that I'm hoping to achieve. And right now, I might go for a nice mirror-like high gloss shine, or I may go with more of a natural look to it. So, but the number of coats that I apply is what's going to determine that. The more coats I apply, the closer I can get to creating like a mirror-like shine. The fewer coats, the more natural the finish and the surface will look. The first coat has pretty much thoroughly dried. It's been a couple of hours, so I can apply the second coat. And I definitely need to apply a second coat because I haven't even come close to filling in all the grain. And I want to try to fill the grain on this body to get it nice and smooth. Now for the second coat, I'm going to apply it a little bit differently than I did that first coat. With the first coat, I applied it to the entire surface of the guitar, the front, back, and sides, and then I hung it up to dry. But what I'm going to do for the second coat is I'm going to apply it just to the front and the sides of the guitar, and I'll let that dry for a couple of hours. Then I'll come back and apply it to just the back and let that dry for a couple of hours. Now the reason I'm doing that is just to show you that there are different ways to apply it. That's one of the many nice features of using the Z-Epoxy finishing resin. It's very forgiving and can be applied using a variety of different techniques. You can apply it to the entire body all at once, or you can do just sections at a time. You can also use different ways of spreading the epoxy around, because it does have a very thin viscosity and a long working time. So I can apply it with my fingers. You can use an old credit card to trowel it over the surface. You can use these disposable foam brushes to spread it around. What I like to do though, and what I found to be most useful, is to initially spread it around with my fingers, and then I can use like a foam brush to get it nice and smooth. So I'll go ahead and get started. Now, it doesn't hurt to flash over the surface with a torch to help pop some of the air bubbles that might be trapped. That's common with epoxy, is that it will develop air bubbles that get trapped, which dry on the surface, and this will just help smooth it out a little bit. It isn't absolutely necessary, but it certainly doesn't hurt. I'm not going to show you the application of each and every coat that I apply to this guitar body, because it's basically the same as what I've just shown you, and it would just be boring. So what I'll do is jump ahead to show you the finished results. However, one thing I think some of you may notice as I apply these coats, I'm not sanding in between coats. I know that with a lot of finishing products, it's always recommended that you sand between coats. You scuff the surface in order to improve the adhesion of subsequent coats. However, Z-Epoxy is an epoxy glue, and you don't really need to sand in between coats because the stuff is so sticky, it'll stick to anything. And it doesn't improve adhesion by sanding between coats, so why bother taking the time? But the other reason is I want to apply sufficient coats not only to fill the grain and the pores of this wood, which is very porous, but I want to build it up thick enough so that later on, when it comes time to level sand, I'm not going to run the risk of sanding through to the underlying finish. So I'm just applying it and letting it dry and then applying it again. So I've got a couple more coats to apply here, and once that's done, I'll show you the results and then explain what the next steps are going to be. Okay guys, I've put down a total of about 4 coats of the Z-Epoxy finishing resin, and that's a little less than half of these 2 6-ounce bottles. So there's enough here to do probably 2 guitars, and that's doing the 4 coats. So what I need to do next is I need to begin the process of level sanding. However, before I do that, I'm going to let this epoxy fully cure, and that's going to take 6 to 8 hours. So I'll just probably let it sit overnight, and then I can begin the process of level sanding. Now, one thing that's important to understand about this product is because of its thin viscosity, it has a tendency to run. And that's why it may be better to do the top in one session, the sides in another session, and then the back in a third session. But if you look closely, and I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but it is pretty bumpy, and there's a lot of little lint specks, and then there's a lot of runs and drips that have formed. but it's not that difficult to work with it and to remove that. And I'm going to show you in the next episode the process that I use for level sanding. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to put down at least 4 coats. It's so that I have sufficient thickness in the material to be able to level sand, to remove the runs and drips and not sand through the underlying finish. If that does happen, and there's a good chance it could, with the particular approach that I use for finishing this, using the aniline dye mixed in denatured alcohol, any sand through can be easily fixed and then repaired with additional applications of the epoxy. So it's pretty forgiving. Now, I know some of you watching are going to probably wonder, Chris, you've got spray equipment. Why wouldn't you spray a finish? Well, I would, except I like to show videos where I offer different solutions, especially for those of you watching who don't have spray equipment. This is a technique that you can use, that you can achieve that mirror-like high gloss shine without having a compressor or a spray gun and the environment in which to spray in. So I would encourage you to check back next week as I continue to move forward with finishing the finish by level sanding it and then buffing and polishing it up to a high gloss shine. So until the next episode, as always, click the thumbs up button, visit eguitarplans.com or my Highline Guitars merch store. There's links in the description below. And any purchase you make there is going to help support this channel so that I can keep making videos about guitar building. And until the next episode, take care and stay safe.